Good morning. My name is Father Justin, and today I'd like to talk to you about the Catholic Mass. 2,000 years ago at the Last Supper, Jesus took bread, he blessed it, and he offered it, and he referred to it as his body. And Jesus took a cup of wine at the Last Supper, he blessed it, and he offered it to God, and he referred to it as his blood. Now in Luke's Gospel, the term for blessing was Eucharistein, which we translate as Eucharist. So today, when Christians celebrate Sunday services where they gather and where the priest takes bread and wine, he blesses them and offers them to God and refers to them as the body and blood of Christ, those services are called Eucharists. Now for Catholics, we call our Eucharist a Mass. The Orthodox refer to their Eucharist as the Divine Liturgy. And Lutherans, Episcopalians, and Methodists, and many other Christian denominations also celebrate Sunday Eucharists. They may refer to them as the Lord's Supper, they may refer to them as a Sunday service, they may refer to them as a Eucharist. Now, Roman Catholics are unique because we also refer to the Mass as a sacrifice. Now, why do Catholics do that? We do that because in the letter to the Hebrews, we are told that Christ offered one sacrifice on the cross. However, when Catholics celebrate the Mass, we believe that we are present for the Lord's Passion. We believe that we are present for the actual event of the Last Supper. We believe at the Mass that we are present at Christ's death, and we believe that we are present at his resurrection. And for that reason, we refer to the Mass as a sacrifice, because we are not only remembering the events of the Lord's Passion, but we have been transported back in time to those events, or those events have been transported forward to us. It would be appropriate to say that when we participate in a Catholic Mass, that the past, the present, and the future converge. Now, the first thing we need to consider is the question, is the Mass a sacrifice or a meal, or is it both? This question has been raised for the past 550 years since the Protestant Reformation, and unfortunately, it has had the tendency to reduce or oversimplify a definition of the Mass or the Eucharist as either a meal that remembers the Last Supper or a sacrifice or both. However, the question is so important, we have to address it before we give a broader definition of the Mass. In the first place, we have to concede Protestants are right. There is a lot of meal imagery in the Mass or the Eucharist. When Jesus celebrated the Last Supper, he was celebrating a meal, and he took bread and he offered it as his body. He took wine and he offered it as his blood. And whenever we celebrate a Eucharist or a Mass, we remember that. At the same time, if a complete stranger were to walk into a church, they might notice on the sanctuary what looks like a table or an altar. They would see that on top of the table or the altar are vessels that look like a plate and a cup. And in addition, they would see food placed on that table or altar, bread and wine. So indeed, there is a lot of meal imagery in the Mass and the Eucharist. And finally, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, he likes to use meal imagery. So Jesus has told stories about God inviting people to a gigantic banquet in Luke's Gospel and Matthew's Gospel. And Jesus is telling a story that is about the kingdom of heaven, and he is using the meal image of a banquet to describe the kingdom of heaven. Now, on the other hand, Roman Catholics and the Orthodox have believed since the time of Christ's resurrection and his ascension into heaven that the Mass is a sacrifice. Why do we believe that? Because all Christians believe that Jesus sacrificed his life on the cross for the salvation of souls and the redemption of humankind. The letter to the Hebrews says that Jesus offered one sacrifice. So why is it then that Catholics call the Mass a sacrifice? The answer is very simple. We believe as Catholics, and the Orthodox believe as well, that when we participate on a Mass on Sunday, or if we participate in a Eucharist or a Divine Liturgy, that we are transported back in time, and that we are literally present for the Last Supper. That when we participate in the Mass, we are literally present for the death of Jesus on the cross, and we are also literally present for his resurrection. In other words, the Passion of our Lord becomes very real and present to us. For that reason, the Church has defined the Mass as a sacrifice because it makes real the sacrifice, or the one sacrifice, of Christ on the cross. Now, so far we've mentioned that the Mass is a Eucharist where we remember the Lord's Supper. We've mentioned that the Mass has a lot of meal imagery, which is important, and we've acknowledged that the Mass is a sacrifice. At the same time, we need to be able to explain in a meaningful way to a child or to a stranger how important the Mass is to us as Catholics. And I have suggested that you explain to a child or a stranger that the Mass says something about the past, the present, and the future. Or we can say that the past, the present, and the future converge when we celebrate the Mass. Now, what do I mean by this? In terms of the past, we remember the Passion of our Lord when we celebrate Mass. We remember Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. We remember the Last Supper when we celebrate the Mass. We remember the death of our Lord when we celebrate the Mass. And we remember His resurrection. But at the same time, as Catholics, we also believe that we are present for those events. We are present for the Passion of our Lord, and we are present for the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, in terms of the present, something very important happens when we participate in the Mass. Not only do we encounter Jesus in other people at the Mass, not only do we encounter Jesus when the gospel is proclaimed, not only do we encounter Jesus in the work of the priest at Mass, most importantly, we encounter Jesus Christ, soul and divinity, His body and blood, when we receive communion. We have an authentic, physical encounter with Jesus Christ when we go to Mass and we receive communion. That is why we as Catholics regard the Mass as so important. That's why we treat the Mass with such reverence and respect. Finally, the Mass tells us something about the future. Whenever we participate in the Mass, we encounter authentically the kingdom of heaven. Now, why can we say that as Roman Catholics? Well, Jesus Christ told His disciples that when they asked Him, "Where is the kingdom of heaven?" He said, "It is right before your very eyes." What Jesus was saying was, wherever I am physically present, there is the kingdom of heaven. So when we participate in the Mass, because we receive communion and because we encounter Jesus Christ physically, we can claim that we have had an encounter with the kingdom of heaven. So in summary, the Mass remembers something about the past, the present, and the future. The Mass is an authentic encounter with the Passion of our Lord. The Mass is a place where we physically encounter Jesus Christ, and the Mass is also a place where we encounter the kingdom of heaven. Thanks very much, and have a great day.